All right.
Fix your hair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophie Brion, and I have the great honor this morning of being your moderator this morning for the People Living with HIV Stigma Index webinar series. This is the second webinar in our series, and today we're going to be talking about the standardized approach of the Stigma Index and taking a standardized approach to documenting HIV-related stigma and discrimination. We do have an excellent web page where you can follow along with the agenda, and you'll also be able to review the bios of all of our excellent speakers today, which will save us a bit of time in introduction. We have a lot of extremely qualified and wonderful people who are here to speak, so we won't spend a lot of time going through all of their resumes. Before we begin, I do just want to let everyone know that there will be language interpretation available, and you should be able to find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And also, I have to give a special thank you to the LAC platform of the Global Fund Strategic Community Engagement for supporting us to provide this interpretation support and making this webinar accessible to speakers of Spanish, which is really great, and we're very excited and appreciative of that support. So without further ado, I have the great pleasure of introducing two speakers, Dr. Gregory Greenwood and Dr. Paul Geist from the National Institutes of Health, who will share with us a little bit about how the National Institutes of Health are providing leadership and prioritizing the measuring and responded to HIV-related stigma and discrimination.
I'll go ahead, Sophie. Should I begin?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophie. I'll share my share my screen. Tell me when you can see my screen. Tell me when you can see my screen.
We can see it. We can see it.
Okay, thank you very much.
But we can see your Zoom screen. You might.
Yes.
We can't. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here for this session of the webinar series. Dr. Greg Greenwood and I are happy to be here to open the session. And we thank Pim Lozay, Kieran Dunaway, Omar Serif, and Steph Baral for the invitation to do so. There are quite a few attendees today with our colleagues and friends, of ours among you. For example, Dr. Diane Rausch, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health's Division of AIDS Research, is here, as I think Laurel Sprague is as well. We would like to acknowledge and thank them for being here with us today. I was asked to talk with you about the National Institutes of Health, referred to as the NIH HIV Research Program, and the central role my office, the NIH Office of AIDS Research, has, all in about 5 minutes. So here we go. For grounding, the US government has a number of official departments, and NIH is one of the 11 operating divisions or agencies within those departments, within one department, the Department of Health and Human Services. Sibling agencies include some that many of you are familiar with, such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration. Others you may not be as familiar with, for example, the Administration for Community Living. I have NIH in a larger box in this graphic only to show that my office, the Office of AIDS Research, is located within the NIH Director's Office. NIH's mission is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. In short, to turn scientific discovery through research into health. I'm often asked, how big is the NIH? That can be answered in a number of ways, but one way is this slide. The NIH invests $45 billion annually in health research, which translates into about 50,000 active NIH grants and projects per year. Of that, 3.1 billion is for HIV/AIDS research, which translates into about 4,000 active HIV/AIDS grants and projects per year. NIH has 27 institutes and centers, as well as other offices in the NIH Office of the Director. Most, as shown here, are involved in the NIH HIV research program. This is a quick schematic of progress we have all made against HIV and AIDS over the last 40 plus years, including contributions of the NIH HIV research program. The NIH began to fund HIV research in 1982 before Congress provided dedicated funding. Congress established the NIH OAR in 1988, and we've been building and coordinating NIH's HIV research priorities and programs since then. I understand that our slides will be posted online after the seminar, so you can come back to the slide if you would like then. It is also on our NIH OAR website. Currently, there are 5 overarching research priorities of the NIH HIV research program. You can see here, reducing HIV/AIDS incidence, developing next generation therapies, working on a cure, improving treatments for comorbidities and co-infections, and cross-cutting research, basic health disparities training, behavioral and social science research, and information dissemination. There's so much more I could say, but as main closing points here, NIH's approach to the HIV pandemic is unique. It's multidisciplinary and utilizes integrative methods across research areas. Continued research and investment is needed to sustain the momentum and make further needed advances. Bringing together the biomedical, behavioral, and social implementation, data, and other scientific disciplines is key to doing that. Research to prevent, reduce, and mitigate HIV-related stigma and discrimination is key to ending the HIV pandemic and is an NIH HIV research priority. Again, our slides will be posted, so I encourage you to check out these ways to learn more about HIV and to stay connected with the NIH HIV research program. And with that, I would like to turn the virtual podium over to my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Greg Greenwood, who will speak more specifically to HIV stigma and discrimination research activities at the NIH. Greg, I'm going to stop sharing now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Geist. Nice to be with everyone. And as we switch, I will share my screen. Okay, and great, so thank you very much. And I will focus around the NIH stigma research efforts. My name is Greg Greenwood. I'm with the National Institute of Mental Health. One good place to have an overview of the HIV-related stigma research areas as a priority at the National Institutes of Health is an AIDS and Behavior article published in 2022. It includes co-authors from NIH across 16 different institutes, centers, and offices. It's a really terrific overview. It provides an overview of the HIV-related stigma research across NIH, both historically and currently. The article provides an overview of each institute, center, and office mission and how their mission shapes their interest in HIV stigma research. And it provides a summary of institute, center, and office-related scientific findings. Each section also articulates the research gaps and future opportunities moving forward with an eye towards key research themes and approaches, including the importance of HIV stigma measurement. The current effort is really built on a number of activities and accomplishments in the last 10 years or so. And it started with, in 2013, NIMH, the Stigma Action Network, the UN Program on HIV/AIDS, and the STRIVE Program Consortium published a special issue in JIAS on HIV-related stigma. About 3 years later, NIH Office of AIDS Research and NIMH and the White House hosted a meeting on HIV stigma with a focus on interventions, measures, and actions. In 2016, 2017, the Fogarty International Center led a workshop at NIH for a more global focus around stigma, with a particular focus around measurements and implementation and interventions. That then resulted in a journal supplement in BMC Medicine 2019. And this is really a terrific collection of articles around the gaps and opportunities for stigma just broadly. Specific to the GMP plus and the people living with HIV stigma index, NIMH and NIH partners are expanding our approaches to addressing stigma. There's an administrative supplement that was funded to Dr. Stefan Baral for his larger research study on the validation of stigma metrics. And this administrative supplement is for researchers to collaborate with GMP Plus on expanding the sampling and methodological analytic plans for planned stigma indices to be implemented by GMP Plus and local implementers in 31 countries. Another way that we have expanded our HIV stigma research is through promoting reductions in intersectional stigma to improve the HIV prevention continuum. And that has a specific focus around intersectionality. We partnered with the NIH Office of AIDS Research to host a 3-phase workshop in 2020 that was organized by Drs. Maureen Goodenow from OAR and Dr. Diane Rausch from NIMH. The workshop was designed to advance HIV prevention and treatment science with a specific focus around intersectional stigma and discrimination. You can find a full workshop summary in the link provided on this slide, as well as links to the webinars. This workshop then led to a special issue in the American Journal of Public Health titled Addressing Intersectional Stigma and Discrimination to Improve HIV-Related Outcomes. It was published on June 28th of 2022, and we will have a launch of this special issue at AIDS 2022 on July 31st in a satellite session. Finally, there are 2 other efforts at NIH. One is around the stigma scientific interest groups, which includes intramural and extramural NIH folks focused on stigma measurement, interventions, and implementation across the spectrum. 3 of our directors from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institute on Mental Health, and National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism published an article focusing on the importance of addressing stigma and language. And finally, we have a stigma and discrimination research toolkit that's publicly accessible to promote advances in stigma measurement, interventions, and language. And with that, I thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for giving us a little bit of insight into some of the amazing work and leadership that the NIH is providing around expanding this work on documenting stigma and discrimination and some of the partnerships that you're developing. This is really exciting. And now I'm going to introduce Karen Dunaway, who is the ICW Gender Equity Officer, who's going to share a little bit about the Stigma Index International Partnership and give us an introduction to why the Stigma Index is such a great tool and has such a wonderful methodology. Karen, take it away.
No, thank you, Sophie. And thank you, Paul and Gregory, for the presentation. It was really interesting. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all who joined the webinar today. And it is a pleasure for me to take the next 10 minutes to talk about the international partnership of the Stigma Index. Actually, this slide was added because at the launch of the series on the first webinar, we could see that there was more interest in knowing the partnership and the technical support that we have done in the last few years, exactly in the last 2 years. Next, please. Thank you. So who is in the international partnership of the People Living with HIV Stigma Index 2.0? The Stigma Index is coordinated by an international partnership of two global networks of people living with HIV. That is the International Community of Women Living with HIV, ICW, and the Global Network of People Living with HIV, GNP+. We also have the support in the international partnership of the Joint United Nations Program on HIV, that is UNAIDS, and we have the support as well of Johns Hopkins University. And how do we work and what do we do? Next, please. The work that we do is that we provide technical assistance to networks of people living with HIV that are implemented the Stigma Index. Since the launch of the new standardized methodology in 2020, the international partnership aims to ensure that the Stigma Index non-negotiables, methodology, and quality standards are met. We also guarantee that the JIPA principle is met and ensure the meaningful leadership of networks of people living with HIV, networks of women living with HIV, and networks of key population living with HIV. Since the start of the new standardized methodology in 2020 and the start of the international partnership, we have been helping several and a lot of countries the past 2 years. And right now there are more than 50 countries that are currently implemented the Stigma Index 2.0. Next, please. This is a summary, an overview of the flow path on our work. We start and we do introductory calls on the implementation of the Stigma Index to organizations and countries that are starting the process, explaining the implementation steps, the non-negotiables, as well as the importance of gender equity since the beginning steps of the implementation. There is also TA, there's also technical assistance on work planning if the country desires to, but and especially for countries doing the study for the first time. There's also introduction to a standardized methodology and we'll have the person what is prior to the submission to the National Ethics Committee to ensure that compliance with the standardized methodology, quality standards, and to support the meaningful engagement and leadership of networks of people living with HIV. This include the meaningful engagement of women living with HIV and key populations living with HIV. We also do several rounds of report review before the publication of the study. And before that, we do data collection, data analysis, and advocacy planning support as well, since we know that the index is much more than a survey. The index, the Stigma Index, is a study to create evidence-based advocacy with an intersectional gender focus and to make affirmative changes in the country. Next, please. Some of the tools that we have created to help the engagement and the leadership and the good implementation of the standardized methodology is that we have created the implementation guidelines, that is a handbook to support networks to conduct the Stigma Index. There is an advocacy toolkit on how networks can take forward advocacy actions after the implementation. We also have a gender advocacy toolkit that is a toolkit to strengthen the engagement of networks of women living with HIV in the Stigma Index. There is a qualitative research toolkit to support networks in qualitative research on the Stigma Index. And some of the capacity building activities that we have done is we also do the Stigma Index Academy, which I hope you have heard of before, or even better yet, if you have had the opportunity to be part of this virtual academy learning space for people living with HIV to increase technical skills in the Stigma Index implementation. We have done 3 regional academies to date, and we are expecting to do a couple more during this year. And another activity of capacity building we have done is the Gender Equity in the Stigma Index training. That is a virtual workshop to deepen the gender analysis and to ensure gender equity in the Stigma Index implementations. We have done 5 country workshops so far, and actually next week we will have our first regional training in Latin America for the Gender Equity workshop. All these tools were created to strengthen and increase the capacity of networks to effectively implement the standardized methodology. And before we move on to understand what a standardized methodology of the Stigma Index 2.0 looks like, I would like to take 2 more seconds to explain why a standardized methodology is important. When a standardized questionnaire, when we use it, and we use it each time, it makes possible to compare the situation of people living with HIV in different countries on specific issues, such as access to HIV testing and treatment. And perhaps some of you joining us today has been involved in the Stigma Index processes once or twice. You know that the study allows us to measure changes over time. This include whether the situation has worsened or the situation has improved. We can actually see for which group of people and in which settings. So it is crucial to systematically gather evidence on a stigma and discrimination using trustworthy and validated research tools that include intersectional issues that field the stigma and discrimination in the lives of women living with HIV, people living with HIV, and key populations living with HIV in order to address HIV-related stigma, which is a significant human rights-related barrier. Another work that we have done because of the standardized methodology, and as for secondary analysis of the Stigma Index data, we are working on a regional report based on the latest implementation using the standardized methodology. And as well, we are working on a global report on reproductive coercion based on the Stigma Index data. So that, as a mere conclusion, the standardized methodology allows us to comparisons to be made within the same country across time and across different settings. Next, please. Okay, thank you. If you have questions regarding the Stigma Index, please feel free to email us and to see that website as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. That was really detailed, and hopefully it will spark everyone to take a look and learn a little bit more about the Stigma Index methodology. And now, without further ado, I will introduce Pim Lowe's from GNP+, who is the Stigma Index officer, who's going to share with us a little bit more about the standardized methodology in detail and give us a little bit more insight into some of the aspects of the methodology.
Thanks, Sophie, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Sophie mentioned, I'm going to briefly introduce the standardized methodology for the Stigma Index that we launched about 2 years ago. Like Karen said, I think what's important is that we already had a standardized questionnaire. So we were asking the same questions in every Stigma Index implementation, but the change that happened 2 years ago is that it's the same methodology now as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce the key elements of the standardized methodology. So it was launched early 2020. We have developed an agreed set of standards and principles that must be followed in all Stigma Index implementations. By having a standardized methodology, it will strengthen the overall quality across the Stigma Index implementations, and it will allow for comparisons to be made over time within a country, but also across different settings. There are a few elements of the standardized methodology that I will go through. You can see it here in the bottom. One is the geographical scope of the study. One is the sample size and the target population. And then we have the sampling strategy that is twofold. The sampling strategy consists of venue-based sampling and limited chain referral sampling. So let's start with the geographical scope. I'll start by explaining a term that we use, which is SNU, which stands for Subnational Administrative Unit. We use this term because in different countries, different terms are used to define the areas within that country, such as region, province, district, etc. So therefore we use the term SNU. When a country team decides on the geographical scope of the study, what needs to happen first is all the different SNUs in the country should be mapped out. So there's an overview. Then we need to look at the different and relevant characteristics of these different SNUs, such as HIV prevalence, the availability of services, rural and urban areas, existing PLHIV and key population organizations in these areas, and other important geographical differences that might differ per context. For instance, in some countries, there might be migration in certain areas that you want to take into consideration. Once we've mapped out all the different SNUs and the characteristics, the country team can then decide on which of the SNUs should be included in the study. Because in most cases, it's simply not possible to include every area of a country in the geographical scope of the study. So therefore, we can make a selection that will represent the country and conduct the study in those areas. As you can see, this is so far, deciding on the geographical scope is not very standardized. Countries still have flexibility to make their own decision. The only regulation that we have on deciding the geographical scope is that the selected SNUs must cover at least 50% of the estimated PLHIV population in the country. Just to be clear, that doesn't mean 50% of the estimated PLHIV population must be included in the sample. It means that the selected SNUs must cover at least 50% of the estimated population. Then we move on to the sample size and the target population. So the sample size is based on a key area of the questionnaire, which is fear or avoidance of seeking healthcare by PLHIV due to anticipated stigma. We chose this as to power the sample size because it shows up as a key area across different settings. In addition, there's a question in the standardized stigma index questionnaire from which we can get this data point. So all countries that have ever done stigma index before will have this data available to then calculate the sample size. If a country hasn't done the stigma index before, that's okay. We can always look at data from a neighboring country with a similar epidemic, or there might be regional data that we can use to inform the sample size calculation. We have developed an online sample size calculator specifically for the stigma index, which you can access here, and these slides will be shared. And then when we look at the target population, at least 25% of the sample must be allocated to key population participants. That is gay men and other men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, and people who use drugs. In addition to that, every key population group must consist of at least 50 participants. This is to ensure that we can do disaggregated analysis, that we can look at one key population, run separate analysis to also compare the findings. Last but not least, when we're talking about the target population, it's important that PLHIV who are not linked to care and or treatment are also included in the sample. And as you can see, this requirement is linked to the area of the questionnaire that's used for the sample size calculation. Let me go to the next slide. Then we get to the sampling approach. As I mentioned, we have a twofold sampling approach. Part of the sample will be recruited through venue-based sampling. So this is proportional sampling at geographical sites where people living with HIV may visit. And there's also limited chain referral sampling. This is where we leverage people's social networks for the sampling process. In most cases, about 25% of the sample will be recruited through venue-based sampling and about 25% through limited chain referral. These proportions, however, are not set in stone. We realize that different sampling approaches will work better in different contexts. So there is flexibility in this ratio. Now we'll look at venue-based sampling. The process of venue-based sampling, or at least the first step of this process, is to identify which venues will be included in the venue-based approach. To do that, we will recruit PLHIV community liaisons. These are people living with HIV or know people living with HIV through their occupation or social interaction. The community liaisons will help us identify the venues, the specific venues where we will recruit participants. So what happens is we conduct short interviews with PLHIV community liaisons to identify which venues could be included. And then we deduplicate these lists of venues and decide on the final list of venues in the selected areas where we will recruit participants. Note that this should include a variety of venues. That is not only healthcare facilities, because by including only healthcare facilities in this sampling approach, we may end up with a biased sample whereby mostly people living with HIV who are connected to care will be included in the sample. Then we get to a very practical part. I won't get into that too much, but the study team should, of course, then start contacting all the venues, make necessary arrangements with the venue managers, decide on a time interval for the sampling at every venue. And then at that time interval, possible participants can be approached and asked to participate. So in brief, that is the venue-based sampling approach. The second sampling approach that should be used in all Stigma Index implementations is called limited chain referral. I'm sure most of you are familiar with something called snowball sampling. And in principle, limited chain referral is the same, except that it is limited, which means that every person can only recruit a limited number of other people into the study. And this is done to ensure diversity in the sample. So for instance, participants will receive 3 business cards that they can distribute to their peers to see if they might also be interested in participating. The country coordinator can then check their eligibility, and if they're eligible, make arrangements for the interview. Please note that the number of business cards, so here it says 3, but this may differ. If there is a certain population that is underrepresented in your sample and you still have a few weeks to go with data collection, you may choose to increase the number of business cards given to certain participants to try and increase that number in the sample. So that is it from my side. I realize I went quite quick and it was a bit technical perhaps, but that is a brief overview of the standardized methodology that we use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pim. Yes, it's a lot to cover, but hopefully it sparked people's interest in kind of getting a bit more information, and they can reach out for more details. But you've definitely given a lot of food for thought in terms of the aspects of the methodology and the sample size and how rigorous it is, which is really great. And now we are absolutely thrilled to hear from some implementers. We're going to hear this morning from Abdul Qadir Ibrahim from NEFWAN, who's joining us from Nigeria and who's going to share a little bit about the lessons that they've learned in the country implementation. Should we take the question before we have Abdul Qadir speak, or should we move on with the...
I would suggest we conclude all the presentation, then we can go to Q&A.
Okay, fantastic. So Abdul Qadir, you're up to share some information and lessons learned from the country implementation in Nigeria.
So we have the slides shared. I don't know if the Secretariat will put it on.
Yes, we're going to share from our end. If you can give me a couple of seconds. Just a slow internet, sorry.
While Omar's getting the slides up, I'll just go ahead and let you all know that right after Abdul Kadir speaks, we'll have Tondarai Moreka from ZNNP Plus from Zimbabwe, who's going to share a little bit about the experience. So Abdul, as soon as Abdul Kadir's finished, Tondarai, you can jump right in. All right, slides are up.
So thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, as you know, my name is Abdul Kadir Ibrahim, representing the network of people living with HIV and AIDS in Nigeria, as you can see from the people living with HIV stigma index survey that we have conducted in Nigeria. Please, next slide. Huh? So this is just the content of what we'll be talking, and I will try as much as possible to be very brief and concise. So you can see the background information about NEP1, then the methodology of the PLHIV stigma index, talking about geographical scope of the study, total sampling size, sample size and composition by state, gender, and KP typology. Of course, the formula for calculating the sample size, recruitment of the participants, and also findings and recommendations, implementation challenges, and the lesson learned. Next slide, please. So this is just a background about NEP1. And as we all know, as colleagues, in each country, we have a national network or associations of persons living with HIV and AIDS. And NEP1 is the national umbrella body that coordinates and administers all support groups and constituencies of persons living with HIV and AIDS in Nigeria. And our strength of membership is about 1,030 support groups across the 36 states plus the FCT, which is the capital state territory of the Federation. And we also have chapters across all the 36 states, as you can see from the subsequent slide where the study have been conducted. We also have a constituent bodies which serve as a part of the network. We have Association of Young People, Women, and of course, religious bodies living with HIV. Next slide, please. So this is majorly our mission, and it's just to empower, strengthen, and coordinate generally PLHIV and associations of persons living with HIV so that everybody can contribute meaningfully to the HIV and AIDS response. And our core activities also include coordination and advocacy, community-led interventions, treatment adherence that comprises retention on care, which we are focusing on the second 90. And you can see we have achieved 95% of retention capacity in Nigeria, but still struggling in ensuring people are placed on treatment, especially on the first 90. Then we have our guiding framework, which of course the registration with the Corporate Affairs Commission of Nigeria. We also have a constitutions that that guide our operation, and of course we have developed a 5-year strategic plan that also guide our internal activities and our operational planning. And we also have operational manuals and policies that continue to aid our existence as a credible organizations in Nigeria. Next, please. So now this is the geographical scope of the stigma index. From the map, you will see that, let me tell you one thing, Nigeria is so big to an extent that it has to be divided into regions and also zones. We have Nigeria as a whole, and we have two major regions. The northern region, please come back. Yes, we have the northern region and the southern region. And you can see the map is indicating the states where the survey has been conducted, and this has been conducted in 17 states, including the FCT. Please, next slide. So this is the sample size and the composition, and the target for the total sampling size for this stigma index was 1,235, which was spread across the 17 states. However, we have achieved 1,240, which surpassed even the initial target. And then the sample size was calculated following the standardized methodology developed by the International Partnership for the PLHIV Stigma Index, as you can see here. And of course, the formula you are seeing was also used for the calculation of the sample size of the study. Next slide, please. So this is still the formula size and the calculations you can see even from the previous survey and the interpretations of some of the elements used in the calculations of the survey. So next slide, please. So this is the summary and the composition of the states of the stigma index survey in Nigeria. And it will be good to just mention the state. As you can see, we have Abia, Anambra, Edo, Enugu, Gombe, Imo, Kaduna, Kano, Oyo State. And you can see the total number per state based on terms of the sample size and the proportion, and of course the number of data collectors per state, which generally is conducted in 10 days. So next slide, please. So we also have Taraba, Akwa Ibom, Rivers, Cross Rivers, Lagos, FCT, Nasarawa, and Benue State. In total, we have the total number of 1,235, and the proportion is 100%. And then the total number of the data collectors were 40. So next slide, please. So now, out of the 1,240 that participated in the survey, 802 amounting to 64.7% were women, while 438 amounting to 35.3% were men. Then the sample size disaggregation by PLHIV and KP was 75% PLHIV, all encompassive. That shows that even within the key populations, we also have those that also live with HIV among the community of the key population. So that has also been analyzed. And then while 25% for the general KP community was also recorded. And the KP group was also further disaggregated by the typologies as follows, you can see. So we have 161 amounting to 13% were female sex workers, and 81 with 6.5% were men who have sex with men. That is the MSM. And then we have 57 in percentage, 4.57% were people who inject drugs. That's the PLHIV. So this is the disaggregation of the KP based on their typologies. And I'm happy that this is really coming out very clear in this study, even though the numbers are still very minimal, but I'm proud about NEP1 report in Nigeria in collaboration with the KP Secretariat to achieve this. Next slide, please. So this is the sampling strategy, venue-based sampling and limited change referral. And to achieve this diverse and intersectional experience of the stigma, 2 strategies were used to recruit participants. As you can see, the venue-based sampling and the limited change referral. And a total of 79.3% of respondents were recruited using the venue-based sampling, and while 20.7% were recruited using the limited change referral system. Note that prior to the participant recruitment, formative key informant interviews were also conducted to determine and validate the site for recruiting study participants. Next slide, please. So these are the key findings and the recommendations. And I will be just mentioning some of, I will highlight in each tabular form. So PLHIV and MSM constituting the 26% and 31% experience HIV-related stigma and discrimination in the last 12 months in the greater proportion compared to other groups. So this is one of the major findings we observed and recorded, especially within the KP community. Then Northeast and North Central geopolitical zones, as you can see initially, Nigeria is too big. We have 2 regions, and we also have 6 geopolitical zones. We have the South-South, Southeast, and the Southwest, then the Northwest, Northeast, and the North Central. Out of this zone, 2 major zones, the Northeast and the North Central zone reported experiencing greater proportion of stigma and discrimination within the last 12 months during the study under review. Then no, go back. What's happening? Then healthcare workers revealing respondent HIV status without their consent was the most reported stigma issue, and PLHIV were not able to seek redress. This is a very strong gap, but of course, in each findings we come up with recommendations, and this is our recommendations. PLHIV and KP must be educated on their right and actions they can take to seek redress on issues of their right. It's one of the major things. You need to educate people and let everybody be well informed about how they can even seek for redress in terms of education, where to go, and even how to report and document some of these abuses and discrimination. Then engaged, sensitize, and train healthcare workers, community leaders, women groups, and generally faith-based organizations, youth group, and other non-governmental and civil society organizations working on HIV and stigma, including risks of vulnerability, disclosure for PLHIV and key population. Then systematic approach to sensitize educational institution and inclusion of HIV and AIDS in school curriculum. So these are some of the recommendations we proposed, and we are working in synergy with different partners, especially UNAIDS and the government of Nigeria and PEPFAR and Global Fund generally, to see how we can address some of these challenges. Next slide, please. So after getting all the findings and recommendations, we also have some challenges recorded with the implementation of the standardized methodology. And one is the sample size. More people were willing to participate, but the target was limited, meaning that generally going to community to work to be able to achieve large scale of participation, then resources need to be provided, and we have limited availability of fund, and the total money provided for this survey, if I can still remember, was just around 53 million naira. So that is just for that. While the protocol did not factor in volunteers with no incentives. Then security issue also is an issue, not only in the Southeast zone where it has impacted negatively, especially due to curfew and lockdown in 4 states of the Southeast, where there is an order for sit at home by the indigenous people of Biafra, claiming to have an independent nation out of Nigeria. So it has really affected the study, but still we're able to reach out and get some information. Then NEPON staff that coordinated different aspects of the study did not have previous training in handling the similar study, because we have a new people on board, and we are happy. One good thing that the Stigma Index has actually achieved is to ensure that PLHIV lead the process, and this is the first time on this Stigma Index we're able to lead the presentation. Next slide, please. Next. So these are just some of the challenges also encountered. Next slide, please. So this is the final, and these are some of the lessons learned. The trend in the stigma and discrimination over the last 3 waves in 2011, 12, and 2021 of the implementation in Nigeria shows significant improvement across the key indicators. This one was a very good one. Then the involvement of community actors at all stages of the study was also helpful. And inter-organizational support from the technical and the steering committee created a huge resource base that helped in minimizing technical errors which will have been affected, the result of the study negatively. So thank you for your patience and attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll be hearing from Tondorai Moreko from Zimbabwe, who's joining us from ZNP+, who's going to share with us a little bit about some lessons learned from the implementation in Zimbabwe. I don't, is Tondorai on the call? I believe.
I'm afraid he may have dropped off. He mentioned some connectivity issues earlier.
Okay, thanks for letting me know, Pim. Okay, so Abdul, while I sort of give Victoria a heads up that she's going to be up next to share with us a little bit about how the Stigma Index data is being used for global AIDS monitoring, I do just want to say that your presentation was really exciting from a couple of perspectives, but I really appreciated the excitement that you showed around the inclusion of key populations and the gender breakdown. So that was really interesting for me to hear, and I think something that we're all very excited about as an outcome in these country implementations, and hopefully carried through to the recommendations and efforts to reduce and eliminate stigma. So Victoria, hopefully I gave you a little bit of a heads up there, but without further ado, I will introduce Victoria Ben Daud, who's joining us from UNAIDS, and who's going to give us a little bit of a background and some information about how the stigma index data that's coming from these country implementations is now being used in global AIDS monitoring processes.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So I will just share my screen. So I hope you can see that. I'm just entonces.
Victoria, it seems we're having a little bit of trouble seeing your screen. I don't know if, does Omar have your slides by any chance?
I don't have, but if Victoria can email it, I can share it from my end.
Let me see if I can see if you can maybe try again, Victoria, and then I don't know if you can send it to Omar and he can get those slides up while perhaps you can share some starts and we can go through the slides in detail when
Can you hear me at all? Because it seems frozen from my end.
we can
hear you.
Okay, that's good. It's the whole computer is frozen, so I'm very sorry.
So I see, Victoria, should we switch back to Tandurai? I see that he has arrived. While we sort out the slides for you.
Okay, that sounds good. So I will try to disconnect and reconnect, perhaps. Sorry about that.
Okay, sounds good. Tandurai, welcome back.
Hi. My apologies. My connection is not stable, and so it's up and down, and so I'm in and out. But I can do my presentation. Thanks.
Great. Please go ahead. I know Omar's going to get your slides up on the screen, and we will. Maybe you can start a bit while Omar's getting the slides up, and you can give us an introduction to your presentation and tell us a little bit about the implementation in Zimbabwe.
Okay. So thank you very much, guys, for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity. And so ZNP Plus, just like our colleagues in Nigeria, is a national network of people living with HIV, which represents the interests and activities of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe across the 10 provinces. The organization has a national reach and it has been coordinating the Stigma Index, starting with Stigma Index 1.0 and now Stigma Index 2.0. And so as well as community-based organizations that are led by people living with HIV. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the organization, currently we are implementing, or we are guided by our strategic plan 2021 to 2025, which have got 4 pillars, which is advocacy, communication, and social mobilization, community system strengthening, coordination of the people living in the HIV sector, and knowledge management, where the Stigma Index is situated. The index is part of knowledge generation. It also fits into other pillars like advocacy, community education, community system strengthening, and coordination of the sector of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe, particularly in the implementation of the Stigma Index study. Next slide.
So it seems we're having some connectivity challenges with Tonderai. So perhaps, oh, he's back.
Yes, and so in terms of geographical scope, the study was implemented across the 10 provinces in Zimbabwe, and it had a mixture of urban, peri-urban, farming, and rural communities. A total of 27 districts were selected across the 10 provinces. And on average, each province had 3 districts, while some had 2. There was also some sampling that was done in prisons. And for purposes of comparison, the same districts that were sampled in 2014 were deliberately sampled to compare the 2014 findings and 2021 findings. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the methodology, the Stigma Index uses the sample size calculator that was developed by the international partnership, and it estimated the prevalence of avoidance of health-seeking behavior due to fear of stigma and discrimination. The sample size was 1,387, but finally we managed to have a sample which consisted of 1,500 participants. Next slide. Okay, so this is the sample size and the composition across the 10 provinces in terms of the distribution, and there was a deliberate effort to stick to the guidelines of the venue-based sampling and limited chain reference sampling, where 25% was allocated to key populations in their diversity, while 75% was also allocated to other people living with HIV. Next slide. Yes, and so in terms of key population, this was the composition of our key populations in terms of various groups. So for gay, we had 12 men, we have 6 men, 49 transgender, 33 sex and people with blacks, we had 3. And next slide. Okay, so as I said earlier on, 75% of the participants were recruited through the value-based sampling methodology, while 25% was limited chain reference. And the venues included health facilities, community places, and households. Drop-in centers were also used as sampling target there. And so in terms of key populations, next slide. Okay, so in terms of our key find before that, but maybe in terms of key populations, we had limited reach for
Oh dear, I think Tonderai, we can't hear you. Oh dear. Okay, I think unfortunately, I don't know if anyone else can hear Tonderai, but I cannot hear him.
Me neither.
Okay, so in that case, I think we will just if we can, Victoria, we're going to put you on the spot again early. You're handling it with such grace. If you could join us and share a little bit about how Stigma Index data is being used for the global AIDS monitoring processes. And if Tandrai is able to rejoin us, hopefully we can hear from him for some lessons, or we can put any questions that people have in the chat for Tandrai about the Zimbabwe implementation, and we can make sure they get answered that way. And as just a reminder, if you have any questions for any of our panelists or speakers, please go ahead and put them in the chat or share them on Facebook, and we will get them in our Q&A. Okay, Victoria.
Thank you very much, and apologies for that. It was a great moment for my computer to decide to run some updates. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join this webinar. In the next few slides, I'm going to share a little bit about the Global AIDS Monitoring, or GAM, framework, and how the data from the Stigma Index surveys are used within that framework, and a little bit about the importance of the standardized methodologies for that in that context. So next slide, please. So just as a way of background, the UN member states adopted a political declaration on HIV and AIDS at the UN General Assembly high-level meeting on AIDS in 2021 that set targets and commitments in the AIDS response for countries to achieve by 2026. Countries are encouraged to report on progress towards these targets annually to UNAIDS. And Global AIDS Monitoring, or the GAM, is the framework based on which progress is reported and monitored. The GAM framework is revised every 5 years, approximately, to reflect the new global commitments in the AIDS response. So as each new political declaration is endorsed or adopted by countries, then the monitoring framework is revised alongside that. The monitoring framework based on this 2021 political declaration is described in 2 documents: a framework document that provides overall guidance on the recommended process to follow for country reporting, as well as an indicator guidance document. The indicator guidance documents provides definitions for each of the quantitative measures that are recommended for use to track progress on each of the targets. It includes the rationale for each of the indicators, the data collection tools that are recommended for gathering that data, and then how to construct each measure. The indicator guidance piece is published every year to reflect any tweaks or adjustments for the following reporting rounds. Countries generally submit on the 31st of March of each year. So most recently, they've submitted on the 31st of March of 2022, and we're currently in the process of reviewing these data, and the final data sets and analysis published later this month in a global report. So the next slide, please. In addition to the quantitative indicators, the GAM framework also consists of a policy questionnaire, the National Commitments and Policy Instrument, or NCPI. All the indicators and measures that are included in GAM were presented and revised by the Monitoring Technical Advisory Group, or MTAG, for consideration. This is a group of measurement experts, including from bilateral partners, other UN organizations, civil society, academia, entities that are leading on data collection, and they provide advice and guidance to UNAIDS on monitoring overall. They accompany the definition of the GAM framework and then the indicator specifics within that. At country level, a national rapporteur from the National AIDS Authority or equivalent is generally appointed by each country as the focal point for GAM, and they're responsible for coordinating the process at country level. The process that's recommended is really a multi-sectoral one that includes ministries and national entities beyond the ministries of health, as well as communities and civil society representatives. They're then also responsible for submitting the data to UNAIDS through an online platform. As part of the country process, it's also recommended that there is that the multi-sectoral process take place throughout, from the planning of the data collection and consolidation of the report, as well as through to the end of the process and submission, including some consultations, potentially for discussion of progress and challenges in the response based on the data that's gathered for submission through GAM. So that data is often used to inform national planning and review processes, as well as global reports and regional reports. The data that are submitted by countries are reviewed once they arrive to UNAIDS. They're reviewed for consistency. They're also compared to other data that might be available from survey reports or other sources. And there's an exchange process with countries to try and clarify or resolve any issues that are observed with the data. Also, if we're aware of data being available for any of the indicators that are recommended, but the country hasn't reported those, then we also encourage reporting on these so that these data can be taken into account within the national consultations on progress and challenges, and then also in future planning processes that might refer to the GAM reports or data in the future. So next slide, please. So the Stigma Index data fits in response to new targets that have been included in the political declaration in 2021 around societal enablers of the HIV response. So these are that less than 10% of countries have punitive legal and policy environments that deny or limit access to services, that less than 10% of people living with HIV and key populations experience stigma and discrimination, and that less than 10% of women, girls, people living with HIV and key populations experience gender inequality and violence. There are sub-targets within each of these, and the Stigma Index is the recommended source for indicators to measure progress towards several of the sub-targets within these three overarching targets. So next slide, please. Thanks. So as of the 2022 GAM, there are 4 indicators that are included with the recommended source being the Stigma Index. And these speak to the sub-targets that you can see on the column on the left. So the indicators are the proportion of people living with HIV who've experienced rights abuses in the last 12 months and have sought redress, the percentage of people living with HIV who report internalized stigma, the percentage of people living with HIV who report experienced stigma and discrimination in the general community in the last 12 months, and the percentage of people living with HIV who report experiences of HIV-related discrimination in healthcare settings. This last indicator had already been included within the GAM framework since 2018 in response to previous targets from the previous political commitments and declarations. So these 4 indicators were developed based on the Stigma Index 2.0 questionnaire, and you can see the questions that are used for construction of each of these in the column on the right. So I think the presentation will be available afterwards to be looked at a bit more closely if there's interest. And for each of these indicators, to better understand whether there's different experiences of stigma and discrimination and seeking redress among people living with HIV, it's recommended that countries look at these data and report them disaggregated by age and gender at least. So the introduction of a standardized sampling and data collection methodology for the Stigma Index has been key for its inclusion within the GAM framework. It's really a key source of information from the lived experiences of people living with HIV. So really the best source to provide the information on where we are in terms of where different countries are in terms of the targets and progress towards these. So the indicators that are included in the GAM framework must meet 6 indicator standards. So they must be needed and useful. It must have technical merit. It must be fully defined, feasible to collect and analyze the data that come from the indicator. They must have been field tested or used in practice. And within the overall set of indicators for the GAM framework, it must provide coherence and balance overall. So really the standardized sampling approach and methodology responds to these standards and the requirements from these standards. It allows, as Karen was mentioning earlier, the comparability across countries and across time within countries, which is really key for inclusion within the GAM framework for measuring progress towards the targets at country, regional, and global level over time. So as 2022 was the first year where most of these indicators were included for country reporting through GAM, we expect that there will be some tweaks and adjustments to the definitions going forward to ensure the measures are as strong as possible and that they're really measuring what they intend to measure. So there's ongoing work around this. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. And this is just to show some examples of draft graphs of some of the data that have been gathered through the grant process for some of these indicators, and that are planned for inclusion in upcoming reports. So as you can see, the green lines reflect the 2025 targets from the political declaration. You can see that the country data that's been reported or gathered from the People Living with HIV Stigma Index reports where available to complement that country reporting. So I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was super interesting and very exciting, I think, for everyone on this call to know that the data from the Stigma Index is kind of influencing these global monitoring standards and really kind of creating space for research that's led by networks of people living with HIV to feed into some of these data-heavy spaces that these this kind of data points haven't really been included in before. So it's really, really exciting to see that, and thank you for sharing that. Now, I will just remind everybody that we do have a few minutes left in our session today for Q&A. And so if you would like to put your any questions you have in the chat or in Facebook, we will go ahead and begin our Q&A session. And I have one question that I'd like to direct to Dr. Greenwood or Dr. Geist. I read a really exciting article that you shared about some of the NIH priorities. And I was really heartened to see, you know, as coming from ICW, a focus on both the experiences, a future focus listed on the experiences of women with stigma and discrimination, and also a kind of a focus on intersectional, understanding the intersectional dimensions of stigma and discrimination listed as some of the future focus in your article. And I wondered if you could share with us a little bit more about that and what some of the future focus that the NIH is thinking about in terms of expanded areas around stigma and discrimination.
Well, Greg, if you want, let me make a general statement and then I'll hand it over to you. Is that, and thank you for that comment, Sophie, and the question. HIV issues as it relates to women and girls is an absolute cross-cutting NIH research priority, as well as a topic. One of the things I had not mentioned in my brief comments is that the NIH HIV research program, through not only my office, but institutes like Greg and Dr. Rausch's, the NIMH, is that we collaborate beyond the NIH as well with you guys, with community organizations, with other agencies of the US government, as well as other governments. In the private sector, we really try to embrace the valued partnerships and that work around the issue of HIV related issues with women and girls is really very high on that list, as well as children and adolescents. Greg, do you want to make further comment?
Thank you. And thanks for the question. I think as Paul just mentioned, both across NIH in the HIV research area, this intersectional approach, kind of recognizing the importance of the intersections of different positions like structural race, structural sexism, you know, HIV, race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status and so on. So I think that there's a collective agreement that we need to think more about those intersectional positions, particularly for adolescent girls and young women, particularly as it relates to gender inequities, gender role relations. And so the Office of Research on Women's Health at NIH has actually started to take the lead around that intersectional space with a focus around structural sexism, and its impact on conditions from HIV and others. So I know that that's very broad. I think that it's on our radar, and there are efforts to move that research space forward, both around measurements, interventions, and implementation. I'll stop there.
You're on mute, Sophia. Oh, there you go.
Thanks. 2 years of Zoom and I'm still on mute. That's really very exciting, and we look forward to seeing how that leadership plays out on that, on kind of incorporating and creating a focus on those issues. Now we have kind of a more detailed question that I'll put to Pim or Karen about why the indicator of people living with HIV who are not in care is used to calculate the sample size. Why was that chosen, and what is the rationale for that?
Thanks for the question, Sophie. The rationale for having that as an indicator is that, of course, the Stigma Index is being implemented globally. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different types of settings, but this did show up as one of the key concerns across different settings. It doesn't mean it's always the priority or the most important concern or indicator in a country, but it shows that we experience it as a relevant indicator across the different settings. Also, by powering the sample size around the avoidance of care, what we're basically doing is making sure that the sample size is large enough to include not only people living with HIV engaged in care, but also those who might not be. So that's some brief background about why we chose this to power the sample size calculation. And maybe I can also respond to Nkechi's question about the percentage of people living with HIV not enrolled on care that should be included in the sample size. So there's no standard percentage of the sample that should be allocated to people living with HIV not on care or treatment, as this can really differ per country. Usually there is UNAIDS country data available on the estimated population of people living with HIV who are not linked to care nor treatment. So we always encourage the country teams to look at the most recent data available, and based on that, allocate a proportion of the sample to people living with HIV who are not engaged in care and treatment. And while we do realize that this population is often harder to reach, it doesn't mean they are unreachable, right? So that's why we have a twofold sampling approach, so that if they might be more difficult to find and recruit through venues, but we may find them through people's social networks and connections. So I hope that answers the question.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Very thorough. Pim is really a wonderful expert on these things. She's a font of information and detail, and we rely on her, and we're very grateful for her knowledge. And Tonderai, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm really hoping your internet is going to work, but we wanted to give you a chance to kind of comment on how the standard methodology implementation experience was in Zimbabwe briefly, maybe a few main points.
Okay, so the standard methodology for us was very useful in terms of sampling, because it also gave us guidance in terms of how to target our subpopulations and calculate the distribution across key populations and the general populations. However, from the onset on our side, I think it was not clear to us that we needed a minimum, a subpopulation of 50 people. Otherwise, for us, it gave us good guidance in terms of implementation and sampling, which was easy, and even the research institution was also very supportive of such an approach, which is international in nature, and also give guidance to implementers of the Stigma Index 2.0. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like this was a really useful tool, and something that you will use in the next stigma index implementation, and you were able to kind of really rely on that to help define the protocol and the other pieces of the research. That's really exciting. Victoria, I have a question that was sent to me about how people can actually use the data, the monitoring data, how they can access it, just so that everyone on our call understands where they can find the data and how they can use the data from the global AIDS monitoring. Maybe a few thoughts on and instructions on how people can access and use that data.
Sure, thank you very much for that question. So all the data that are reported by countries are available on our kind of suite of platforms under aidsinfo.unaids.org. So I can add the link to the chat. And there's the data for the different indicators, the epidemiological estimates, and then as well a link to all the policy and laws data that are reported through that policy questionnaire as part of GAM. There's also the global reports that are published. So there's the global report annually, and then an update that's generally published around World AIDS Day in early December or late November. And so those also include different analyses and presentations of the data. So I can also share the link to that in the chat. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's always really important to make sure everybody knows how they can practically use these excellent resources that are out there in the world for practical purposes. So I think it's really important that we share those resources with all of our viewers and those joining us. So that's really, really great. So one sort of final question before we wrap up today, and this is for Karen. If anybody is interested in learning more about how to ensure that their stigma index implementation is conducted with a strong gender lens, what can they do? What can they do to learn more about this?
We actually have a tool on our website for more information about what is gender intersectional analysis, because one of the past reports, well, some of the past reports since the beginning of the stigma index have shown that sometimes when analysis are done, the reports, they just gather all people living with HIV and says just the number of the participants, but they don't actually disaggregate the data. So that's why we are working on the importance of data disaggregation, not only by gender, but by key population as well, and by young people too, to see the context of where they are right now. And taking advantage of this standardized methodology to see the changes over time on these exact populations. So you can see our tool on our website, that it's Women Live with HIV, in acronyms, WLHIV.org. And if you want to see other reports as well, as because I've seen in the Q&A section, where you can see the reports, the last reports, country reports are on the Stigma Index website, that is stigmaindex.org. There's actually a very interactive map that you can see which countries have done the Stigma Index. And there are more resources as well as the toolkits, the qualitative toolkits, the advocacy toolkits. And there's also information about how you can start your Stigma Index journey.
Excellent. And on that note, we have reached the end of our webinar, and I will just really thank all the panelists here for their passionate presentations about a subject that we obviously all hold dear. I'd like to let everybody know that this is the second of 3 webinars, so please stay tuned for our upcoming webinar on the advocacy implementations and advocacy aspects, and how stigma index data is being used in advocacy to kind of shift and the needle on stigma and discrimination, and really create some improvements and reductions in stigma and discrimination. There have been a lot of links that have been shared in the chat to various resources. I do also just want to thank the LAC Global Fund Community Engagement Office for their support of our translation services today. Very important, and hopefully in future we'll have more languages than Spanish. We apologize to the French speakers. And with that, I'd just like to thank you all and hope you'll join us next time for our next webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.